and the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Before today's interview, we'd like to give you some blue news you can use. The 30th Conference of the Parties, or COP Global Climate Summit, has been taking place mid-November in Brazil's Amazon. You probably haven't heard about it because the Trump administration sent no U.S. delegation, and U.S. corporate media is cutting back on its climate coverage, including CBS News that just killed its 6-person climate production unit. This year's summit has been dominated by Indigenous protesters demanding protection of their Amazon rainforest home, Chinese entrepreneurs hawking the next generation of green power technology with no U.S. competition, and a brief visit by Governor Gavin Newsom, who noted that California, the world's 4th largest economy, is still a reliable partner when it comes to climate action. This year is also seeing a growing focus on ocean-based climate solutions, including implementing the High Seas Treaty and protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030, topics you can hear more about on past Rising Tide podcasts that you can find at bluefront.org or on your favorite podcast platform. And that's Blue News You Can Use. Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host this episode is our friend and our Sequoias of the Sea Kelp Forest documentary co-director, Natasha Benjamin. So, Natasha, how was your recent screening at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum?
Hey, David. Great to be here. We had a great screening of Sequoias of the Sea at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. We had a full house and a really interesting conversation about what's happening with the kelp forest on the North Coast and the South Coast. And if you would like to find out when the next screening is, go to sequoiasofthesea.org.
It's all kelp all the time, but for now, it's an honor and pleasure to be speaking with Amy Bowers-Cordalis. Amy's the former general counsel for the Yurok Tribe, the largest of California's many tribes based on the Klamath River in Northern California. Co-founder of the Ridges to Riffles Conservation Group with Molly Myers, she's been named Champion of the World Laureate by the United Nations, one of Time's 100 most influential climate leaders, and now the author of a new book, The Water Remembers: My Indigenous Family's Fight to Save a River and a Way of Life. Amy, usually our first question for our guests is about their first connection with the ocean, but since all rivers connect to the sea, let's ask what your first memory of wild water was.
Oh, I love that question. My first memory of wild waters is not even a visual memory, it's an embedded experience. My family is from the village of Requoy at the north side of the mouth of the Klamath River. And our ancestral home is called the House of Leuk. And that is an old Yurok traditional redwood plank house. And it's where I have spent most holidays, and that's where we go and stay. That's home base during fishing season. I grew up just running around the village area and then grandma's house, and it sits overlooking the Klamath estuary, the mouth of the Klamath River, and the ocean. And so my first connection with wild water was just being in that place and being surrounded by different forms of water. There's the ocean there with the waves, and there's always these extremely powerful waves at the mouth of the Klamath. And then you go inland in the mouth, and that's a really powerful exchange of different kind of water, of salt water and fresh water merging. And then you're in the estuary, and it's just like deep and wide water. But then, of course, it's right in the middle of the redwoods. And so often there is fog and mist, surrounding you.
It's amazing when you stand on the bluff at the mouth of the Klamath and you look, and it's forest as far as you can see. And to think you're in the most populous state in the nation, it's just hard to grasp how much is still wild. Of course, there's been decline over time. Before we get into that, let's just ask a bit more of your history, because you were general counsel for the tribe, which means you went off to law school and Tell us a bit of your own history from that first experience of water.
I grew up fishing. I grew up hearing the family stories about all these fights just to be on the river, right? Just to sort of survive colonization. And I write about those in the book. And so I just felt like I had to get all this out in a narrative format so that people could know this history, but also like share this experience with me. So I heard about the family Supreme Court case, the fish wars, and how the family fought back against federal marshals armed with machine guns, and how we, even like my dad, who's one of the most kindest humans I know, he drove around with a machine gun in his trunk because they weren't safe. And then I grew up hearing these fish stories, like amazing fishing stories about catching, lots of salmon in one night, and how much fun and all the hard work it was, and the role of salmon and the value of salmon in feeding our families and continuing our fishing way of life. And so I just had a deep, deep love for the river, for our culture, for our salmon. And then in 2002, a tragedy hit. Over 70,000 adult Chinook salmon died in the Klamath River, on the lower part of the river within the Yurok Reservation. I was in college then, and I was home that summer when the fish kill happened, and working for tribal fisheries. And my job that summer was to go and count the amount of salmon harvested by Yurok tribal members. And so I spent the whole summer up and down the river talking to the people. And then when the fish started dying, it was so deeply moving and profound. And I had spent so much time with the people that summer growing up that I just knew how it was like we were under attack again, and how hard that was for all the Yurok families who, one, depended on salmon for their livelihood, but also like we as Yurok people have a duty to protect Yurok country, to protect our salmon. And so I just felt compelled to try to do something to help. And I talk about this in the book, but I had this really profound moment on a Yurok fisheries tribal boat, looking at the dead fish. And I just felt like my great grandma, who had passed away 20 years before, came to me and was like, you got to stop this. We can't have this anymore. And then my next thought was, you got to go to law school. So I went to law school, and, the whole goal was to get a legal education and be in a position to try to help my tribe. And so I felt really lucky. I went out to Colorado for law school and was able to work at the Native American Rights Fund for a period of time. And then eventually was called home. I'll never forget a call I got from the then Yurok chairman saying, Amy, it's time. And he had asked me to be general counsel, and things on the river were really, really bad. That was 2016. There were annual fish kills of baby fish. And so the river was just getting sicker and sicker, and the dam removal agreements were not certain. There was a companion agreement that had just basically terminated. So things were just awful. And I just thought, well, this is what you've been training for. This is what you were called to do. And
for those who haven't yet read The Water Remembers, let's go back a little. There was, during the gold rush and following it, there was what Governor Newsom in 2019 admitted was a genocide against California Native Americans. You fast forward, cultural fire setting was outlawed as arson. And then the fish wars of the 70s and 80s was about reasserting tribal rights or treaty rights to fish salmon on the rivers. Fast forward, and I wrote about the 2002 fish kill was more like a fish assassination.
yes.
And that Gail Norton, the Secretary of Interior under George Bush Jr., opened floodgates for alfalfa and potato farmers in Eastern Oregon against the science that had put forward by NOAA. And that resulted in this disaster of the salmon kill-off, but also kind of inspired, I guess, the continued growth of the tribal movement and some environmental groups. But In the end, it was just Friends of the Rivers as an environmental group and the 4 tribes of the Klamath who did what?
Everything we could to save our culture and ourselves. At Yurok, we have a myth that says if the salmon die, so too do the Yurok people, because there'd be no reason for Yuroks to be here. Because we are so deeply connected to the salmon and the river, and our sole purpose on Earth is to steward them. And so if they go, so do we. And so we fought with that kind of veracity and that kind of determination. And, failure was not an option. After the fish kill, a whole new generation of Indigenous peoples from the Klamath were launched into the fight. And, what was interesting about that time was more and more non-Indians, NGOs, other folks were really also compelled by the fish kill. And the fish kill was tragic. It was awful. And I write about how the fish kill started the last day of a world renewal ceremony that the tribe hadn't done in 100 years. And the whole point of that ceremony is to bring about world renewal and restore balance between humans and the natural world. And so, there's one way of looking at this where it was like that ceremony really did its job. The medicine was really strong. And although we would never wish for the salmon to die in that way, their deaths really did launch the Undam the Klamath movement. And it really showed the humans like, hey, look, you keep up this regime of out of balanced management of this system, like it's going to collapse. And then what? Then what are we going to do? Because the farmers aren't going to be in business if, the whole ecosystem collapses, right? So
can you describe to us, for our listeners, just what happens to a river when you put dams, and why did all these fish die, for folks that might not quite understand what's happening?
There were a few different contributing factors to the fish kill, and the order of the Vice President Cheney to divert an extreme amount of water from the upper part of the basin in southern eastern Oregon to support agriculture, what that did was cause water flows at the bottom of the river, so about 250, 300 river miles lower, where on my village, to be the lowest in history. So not natural, nothing about this is natural. It was the lowest in history, right at the same time as the bulk of that year's salmon run came home. So also a contributing factor was the dams. So the Klamath dams were built right in the middle of the Klamath River without fish ladders. So first off, they're blocking salmon habitat, and salmon are on a mission. They will die trying to get to their spawning grounds. And so that's what they would do at Iron Gate Dam, is they would just hit their heads on the dam until they died. And if you ever went to Iron Gate, there was visible evidence of this. There were salmon carcasses all over. I mean, it was so eerie. It was like a salmon graveyard. But also, what was happening with the Klamath dams was that all of the agricultural runoff was coming down into the reservoirs behind the 4 dams. Where the Klamath Reclamation Project is, and that farming land it's in wetlands. It's former wetlands for the Klamath system, and they converted 200,000 acres of wetlands into agricultural lands. And so what happens is that when you put chemicals on the land, it goes through the wetlands and then into the surface water in the Klamath, and then that would pool behind the reservoirs. And then, water would get really polluted. It would get really hot. You'd have toxic blue-green algae blooms every year. And then that water would go down the entire Klamath River and poison it from top to bottom. Then on top of that, the other thing that dams do is they block the natural sediment that would go down a river. And so on a healthy riverbed, you have lots of little teeny rocks that help kind of just clean the river bar. And so you would block that, and then you would have just clear rock, like hard rock at the bottom of the riverbed. And what was happening is that every year, under these bad conditions, you would have these little worms. Sea shasta, which is a lethal fish disease, would attach to these little worms that would attach to those boulders at the bottom of the river. And that would spread fish disease. And that was what was causing the death of the baby fish each year. Also, behind the dams, there are these amazing cold water springs. And so the function of those was to cool the entire water system down the whole river. But they couldn't get past that, the dams, and they were blocked under the hot, green, toxic water. So basically, all of those conditions was just killing the river. By about 2010, over 90% of the Klamath salmon runs also had been slaughtered. Like, we were down to single-digit percentages. So the legacy impacts of colonization of both the people and the system were really at this apex of we got to do something or there's no future.
This is David Helvarg for Blue Frontier, the voice for ocean action for over 20 years. This year, with public broadcasting under attack, we continue providing free programming to a number of community radio stations with our Rising Tide Ocean podcast. Rising Tide brings diverse voices of our ocean world to audiences on air and online. Your contribution this Giving Tuesday will help keep this and our other projects afloat. So thank you for your help, and best wishes from the crew at Blue Frontier. So it reversed from confrontation to collaboration to actually take the dams down eventually. Maybe you could talk about what it took to get people to understand that taking out the dams was good for everybody on the river.
It was a very strategic effort, and it definitely started with the grassroots Indigenous peoples of the Klamath. And they are diehards. They are hardcore, and they are brilliant. They organized protests all over the world and, had signs that said things like Warren Buffett kills salmon, because he was the owner of it. What they did was raise awareness about the issue, and they demanded attention. They demanded that the stakeholders be accountable for how their company's business practices were essentially killing their way of life. And then what happened is there's also a little bit of good medicine here too. In 2007, PacifiCorp's Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, license to operate the dams was set to expire. And so in 2006, a relicensing proceeding started, which gave the tribes and our allies an opportunity to advocate for dam removal. And that really launched the whole movement. But without the grassroots effort that really set the stage and educated people in a way that was you couldn't ignore. They were so powerful, you couldn't ignore. So by the time that relicensing hearing started, everybody knew about the issue. And then what was really cool in the FERC relicensing proceeding is that the tribe put forth its ancient federally reserved fishing and water rights and said that these rights demand that these dams come out. And then we coupled those with energy law, the Federal Power Act. We coupled that with environmental laws, a whole bunch of them, to basically make the case that the Klamath dams were so harmful to salmon, to the river's overall health and Indigenous lifeways, that it was against the public interest to keep them in. And then there's this really powerful section of the Federal Power Act, Section 8, that basically says if you're in a river, on a river where there are salmon, you have to have some kind of fish passage in order to get a new license. And so what that meant in the context of the Klamath is that if PacifiCorp wanted to renew their license to operate the dams, which they had to put in some kind of fish prescriptions, which were fish ladders. So then there was an economic analysis completed, and it turns out that it was cheaper to remove the dams than it was to keep them in. And so then we had our turning point. We had a mutual interest that would set the stage to start talking about how we might further expand and develop on that mutual interest. Through dam removal, we took out 441 feet of dam. And what's cool is, there was like earth and rock and rebar and all kinds of things, and we repurposed it or returned it to where it came from. And now we are restoring over 20,000 acres within the former reservoir footprint. We have planted over 19 billion native seeds through the whole area, and there will be restoration projects going on, for at least 10 or more years. And one thing I'm really excited about is that we're also seeing more collaboration between all the Indigenous peoples in the basin. My nonprofit, Ridges to Riffles, is facilitating an inter-Indigenous group that is advising all of this restoration work. And what that does is put tribal leaders, experts with traditional knowledge, with stories about how that area and ecosystem worked pre-colonization. And so we're renewing the world and rebuilding it and decolonizing it. And that's not just good for us, but that of course also creates ecosystems for all the little critters that like that area. And so there, you go there now and it's remarkable.
And tell us about the fish coming back. These are fish that...
Oh, the fish. I mean, the fish. We have a salmon phenomenon happening. It is a straight up
amazing
phenomenon. Yeah, the fish. So this year, the fish have gone past Upper Klamath, so past the dams. They haven't been there in 100 years. So not there for 100 years, but they went past the dams, past Keno Dam, past Link River, past Upper Klamath Lake, and are now in the Williamson and the Sprague rivers. And this is remarkable. When we talk about, we always said we're going to open up spawning habitat for 400 miles, like 400 miles of spawning habitat, and we're about there with all that. Yeah.
Within a year of taking down the dams.
So last year, we took out the dams, and what's remarkable is that, there were every kind of scientific study completed over and over and over again. I mean, 20 years of studies about what was going to happen. And they never anticipated that this many salmon would come back this fast and that they would go back into those spawning grounds, where they hadn't been in 100 years. And this year's salmon were bigger and beautiful and stronger than I've seen in years. I mean, they were just fierce. They just fought, and they were gorgeous. And so I kind of knew, like, these guys are going to do something, And sure enough, I mean, they have just surpassed everybody's expectation. And in doing so, they're really bringing back the basin together. We have this common life force that is bringing us together, and in a lot of ways is making us more accountable for our actions, because what happens at the top of the river so greatly impacts, what happens at the bottom.
And this is an amazing example of when you address this huge human-based problem, nature can come back.
Absolutely. The concept is like essentially remove the dams so that the river's natural ecosystem functions can start performing again. And when we did that, I mean, it was almost instantly the water was cleaner, because you don't have those reservoirs and those stagnant bathtubs. Like everything is just being flushed out. And the river almost immediately was like stronger and healthier and fiercer. And I think those values of, believing in Mother Nature and believing in world renewal, believing and acting on restoring balance, and also having the vision of what the ecosystem looked like pre-colonization really put the Indigenous peoples in a leadership role to give people confidence that if we do this, things will work out. It helps sort of break that inertia. The Klamath is the antidote to the current political and climate crisis. It just is. And there's no denying that it worked. right? I mean, the dams are out, the river's healthier, water quality, water temperatures prove that, the salmon returns prove that. And what's interesting too is that Klamath dam removal was also profitable. It pumped $515 million into the economy. And some of the world's, largest construction corporations were responsible for the physical removal of the dams. And they use the same engineering techniques, business practices, liability schemes, the whole deal, as they use for regular construction projects like building dams or building infrastructure, as they did to take out the dams. So there's a business model, there's a scalable business model that supports nature-based solutions. And I think we just need to lean into looking to the future and learning as much as we can, about good work, right? I feel so grateful that in my work, I get to go out and see other people who are doing this kind of impactful world renewal work. And they're everywhere. There is a movement. There is a movement of people who are using nature-based solutions to solve the climate crisis. And they're accepting that humans are a part of the natural world and that we can actually work to rebuild the world, right? So I'm leaning into that.
It's a global model, what you did on the Klamath, and people want to know more about it. So how do they get hold of your book, The Water Remembers?
You can find it on any major bookstore, website. I encourage you to look at your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it.
It's in your bookstore. Read it because it's an amazing story and it's a personal story and it's a story about solutions led by some amazing tribes, including the Earth, the largest tribe in California.
And an antidote to what we're dealing with right now. This is such a story of hope. Thank you so much, Amy, for being on the show, for telling us your story of the Klamath. Please check out Amy Bowers Cordalis' book, The Water Remembers. And thank you, Amy, for being on the Rising Tide, the Ocean podcast with us.
Wak Lao, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and leave us a review or share it with your friends and other ocean lovers. Follow us on Instagram and visit bluefront.org for more updates and additional resources. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and me, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.